Let's get moving. So thanks for joining today. Really quick and brief, a couple notes before we begin. We are recording this presentation, so if you don't get to listen to it all today, you can grab it on our YouTube channel. If you sign up for our newsletter, we'll let you know. And if you have any questions during the interview, you can sign up at the bottom of our website, at the bottom of the GoToWebinar software, and we'll try to answer those by the end of the webinar. Okay.
We're good.
We're good.
Yeah.
We're on. Okay. So just quickly introducing myself. My name is Brian Edwards, and I've been a keen advocate in this collaboration space around the Microsoft platform since 2000. So here we are in 2018 today, still talking about collaborating on the Microsoft platform and making collaboration and personal file management easier. So I borrowed most of this content for this presentation from my colleagues, such as Mel. So thank you in advance for helping me gather this insight that makes this webinar possible. And I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Mel, or Melanie. I've been working in the digital workplace and sort of internet space for almost 6 years now. And yeah, that's me.
All righty. Okay. So if you don't know much about Habanero, just really quickly, we have two core areas of our business. One of the big areas of our business is helping organizations align around change or transformation that they're going through helping with cultural work. That could be in the area of aligning people with purpose or vision, or just helping create a pathway to organizational transformation. And then the other side of our business is really helping create better digital workplaces in the areas of communication, collaboration, and content. So today we're obviously chatting about the digital workplace, but it's good to be on the lookout for the cultural barriers or perhaps even the cultural fortitude that you have an opportunity to leverage to help you on your Office 365 journey. What we've noted in people rolling out Office 365 is it sometimes is a relatively big transition to organizations that are used to these once every 3-year rollouts of technology to move into an environment where there's this constant change, this constant updating, and where experimentation is a much more important part of being successful. So, just keeping your eyes open for those cultural barriers or those cultural things that might get in the way, and getting on top of those as much as you are the technology is important. What we're going to be doing today is chatting through the Office 365 landscape very briefly. Then we'll dive into some lessons we've learned on implementing Office 365 OneDrive and Groups. We'll go through an interview I had with Mel on a recent rollout of these tools, and then we'll be around for questions and answers at the end. I've already asked this question, so I'm not actually going to put the poll up again. It seems like some of you figured out that the poll was around. What we found is people on the line so far are either in one of two states, this sort of this chaos state of perhaps trying to rein things in and get control of things that have gone a little bit out of control, or they're in a limited rollout. So there's one or two of the tools that have been deployed and rolled out. And just I think one or two of you are just starting your process right now. So no one, unfortunately, in the room has a robust rollout yet. So we look at the Office 365 landscape. Just to give you an overview of that, one of the things that I'm not going to do in this presentation is try to describe, why OneDrive or why Groups. It's a complex environment, and it's as told by the many, many pictures that are available online around trying to help people make sense of the environment. So, what I just wanted to point out today, though, is, if you are trying to figure this out, certainly going out and doing your due diligence of looking at what these tools are, and reading some of the great content that's out there to try and pull a view of this together is an important step of the process. One piece of that I would say is kind of important, maybe more urgently than not, is this idea of the difference between groups and teams. Again, I'm not going to cover that today, but they are two, in some ways, competing concepts in the Microsoft ecosystem, and trying to understand how or which one is best for you is something that you'll need to do in this journey. But today, we are just going to specifically talk about OneDrive and Groups. And when we we talk about OneDrive, what we're referring to is the sort of cloud storage for personal file storage and limited file sharing. And I think that's kind of a new, mostly universally accepted description of it. In its early days, I think a lot of people were trying to use it for a lot broader purposes, and it's over the time just sort of narrowed to be a very successful tool, mostly for replacing people's personal file stores, such as their desktops and stuff. And the other one we're going to look at is Groups, which isn't really a single technology. It's really a collection of technologies of different tools available in Office 365. And they're aggregated together for a group of users. And the idea there is that that group of users, if you need to remove someone or add someone, you can remove them from the group, and they instantly get access to all of the different tools that are part of that group. So these are the two things we're talking about today. Your reasons for migrating, I feel terrible. We've already been through these of sorts with people watching the webinar but not hearing the audio, so I won't necessarily go into a lot of detail around these. But the key point here is you want to be really considerate around what you communicate to your end users around why you're migrating and what the goals are around that. So for example, if you're looking to consolidate your tools, end users are going to need to know that they are going to eventually need to stop using some of the tools that they are currently using. For example, if you're trying to get rid of Dropbox or Box or Slack or other tools that your organization has perhaps adopted over the last 5 to 10 years, this is something that's going to be part of a successful communication strategy around this. So let's dive into what we've learned in rolling out OneDrive in Groups. And the cautionary tale here is this deploy and they'll figure it out, which is often the way that some IT departments, I say often the way they start. And this, I think the reason we turn to this is because we think, oh, people don't have these tools now. They already are figuring out how to use other tools in the market. They should just be able to pick this up and learn. In the case of one organization, as a cautionary tale, they took OneDrive and rolled it out to their entire organization. And it wasn't long before people were using OneDrive for a lot more than it should have been used for. One of the users, for example, started setting up team sites underneath their OneDrive and sending around those team sites to different groups so that they could be collaborating in those environments. They had problems with synchronization where end users were just losing all of their files because the sync tools weren't set up properly. And maybe more significantly, they just didn't have the right supports in place. Their SharePoint resource in the organization wasn't anticipating all of a sudden fielding a bunch of calls for OneDrive because OneDrive sits on the SharePoint sort of technology set. All of a sudden, he was overwhelmed with calls trying to support their use of the tool. So, I guess the whole learning there is just there's more work to be done to get this right next time, and hopefully that's part of what this presentation's going to impart. So one of the key learnings here, and perhaps not so much, the first is not so much a learning as much as a belief from Habanero that this is a really primary way to be successful is being empathetic to where your users are at and understanding their needs. Not just, of course, in the areas of understanding their work environment. Are they mobile? Are they not? Are they desk workers? Are they not? Do they need to externally share or do they not? But, perhaps even more so on the empathetic side where you're trying to understand what their current pains in the organization are. And you can do this through, observational interviews or listening labs where you go in and look at their work environment, evaluating some of the analytics that you might have around how they're currently using other tools. Looking at communications that might be coming through the organization to IT or other groups, and perhaps chatting with user groups or power users or other committees that might have insight about this. A couple that we think are great are something we call observational interviews or listening labs, where you're going in and actually sitting with someone inside of their actual environment. So instead of taking them off into a room, you're observing them in their natural world and looking at all of the different sort of techniques and ways that they've managed to get their work done. And so in this picture here, what you'll notice is this person has a bunch of Post-its or things on the wall that are job aids. There's a big binder where there's some information, stuff scattered around the desk that helps them. And these are very instrumental in helping understand this sort of lived experience of people of working with information. And it doesn't necessarily have to be at a desk. This is a picture of recent listening lab we did with people in the field. So we're out there wearing our warm parkas to ask questions around how they're consuming and managing and leveraging information while they're out in their field jobs. Another way, when we use the word empathetic, another way that you could draw some empathetic insight is leveraging journey maps. So journey mapping is a way to map someone's experience from sort of end to end and look at not just the sort of process that they went through, but also the emotional states or the different stages of relationship that they have with that process. And so this is an example of a bunch of journey maps we created for a client around these different scenarios, such as getting a document remotely, finding working from home, onboarding. And so if we look a little bit closer here, what we see is that you have the process at the top, the things they did, and in the middle there, what they were feeling in it. And in this case, we can see that they were starting off perhaps a little hopeful, but they quickly became defeated and desperate in this process. So a lot of insight as to where you can improve the journey for someone in the process by going through something like journey mapping around their current state. Another thing to really consider is that you need to help users transition from their current tools. And I think one of the things we neglect or sometimes forget is we tend to use the term, we're giving users something new. They've never had something like this before. And so therefore, they're not migrating from anything. But the reality is they're obviously getting their jobs done already in a particular fashion. And so we have to step into their world and help understand what they're currently using or what environments they're in and help them migrate from those environments. So in the case of OneDrive, that might be looking at how they're storing things on their desktop or their personal computers or perhaps their network share, whether or not they're using other cloud storage such as Dropbox or Box to manage their personal files, or in the case of one company, they had people using personal hard drives that they're actually taking home to and from work in order to bring their information back and forth. So there's lots of different environments that you need to consider and look at, and then of course help them with the right tools to migrate from those environments. In the area of groups, obviously one of the big things here is we're helping people with collaboration, which often is through email. Again, also through those same things that you might see with OneDrive. It's also possible that you're moving from an old version of something like SharePoint into a much more complex or much more full-featured environment such as Groups. So helping them transition with the new capabilities inside of Groups is going to be an important part of the journey. So a third learning is develop a one-size-does-not-fit-all mindset. Groups is a lot of things to a lot of people. And frankly, I think when we look at the capabilities that are built on Groups, going back to that original slide, this is a Microsoft slide describing Groups. There's a bunch of stuff there that isn't necessarily needed for every group or every user. So you really do need to find a way to be into the unique users' minds or the unique business cases. And one of the ways to do this is building things like use cases so that you can adopt or create the right solutions based on the problems that you have identified through some use cases or problem definition. Another way that we've seen some success around this is starting to get power users in a room or building out a working group, which kind of looks at an environment of collaboration for a group of people and picks some of the top priority things and then over time continues to chip away at that group. And then lastly, one of the things is shifting your mindset towards this idea of gradual evolution. So building up those usage scenarios, finding some way to experiment in them, doing higher levels of usage and patterns start to emerge from that, where you're able to build a more deep and harmonized practice around it. And so thinking of experimentation and iteration as a way to implement something is another important learning for us. I think this is a very difficult one, but staying ahead of your users, it seems like it's really obvious, but it's actually not easy in the Office 365 world. Office 365 is a dynamic, constantly changing environment. So you actually have to put in practices that enable you to be ahead of your users as opposed to just hoping that you'll stay smarter than them. So in the area of OneDrive, using some early adopter tenants to ensure that you're on top of changes in the platform and making sure you test your environment in those changes. installing the OneDrive app, making sure that you have an environment where you're using the different ways people can access these files and constantly on top of the updates that are happening with the applications. Certainly planning for Macs and PCs, as lots of variety of users out there are using their own machines, or perhaps just you have a complex environment. The experience is different for Mac users than PC users, so understanding that's going to be important. Starting to monitor what people are doing and being ahead of that by watching what they're doing. And of course, like planning for sharing and planning for turnover. So if you don't want people to share from their OneDrive, and there's some implications to letting people do that, such as what happens when the person leaves the organization, what happens to those files, how do other people continue to access them, or just even planning for that turnover when they leave the organization is something that you could do to stay ahead. On the group side, again, using those early adopter tenants to understand some of the new features coming from Microsoft and being a little bit ahead of your end users getting those new features, setting up things like naming conventions so you can avoid early conflicts with lots of different teams or groups being named the same thing. Being on top of teams and modern team sites and hubs and communication sites. This is really just in time, but there's so much emerging from Microsoft that's brand new in this space, and your users will start to see these communications, and you need to be on top of what's happening with those new capabilities that are being brought on by Microsoft and be ready to respond to your users when they want that new functionality or they're looking to take advantage of something. And then, of course, doing some sort of monitoring on groups to make sure that you're aware of how people are using it and where you're being successful. And then lastly, key learning here is don't rely on the help desk to solve their problem. Provide alternative supports to the help desk. I don't mean don't prepare your help desk. Of course, you want to make sure that they know how to answer the questions, but thinking of things like job aids, user groups, power users, etc., are really an important way to ensure that users feel supported and that you don't bog down your help desk with a bunch of questions. And so I'm going to play the interview, and then we'll come back and have a Q&A around it. This is an interview Mel and I just recently had around the experience we had implementing these tools at an organization. And let me go ahead and play that. The genesis of this interview was to talk about a project we recently completed, which I thought actually had to do with the GDPR, thank you. But we learned it hasn't. But before we go into that, maybe first I'll just ask, we can't talk about who the organization is, but maybe you can tell me a little bit about what they're like what are the characteristics of the organization?
Yeah, mysterious. They're a global organization. They've got head office. They think they've got about 3 different head offices in sort of 3 main continents, and then a whole bunch of branches. So they're really spread globally. Great. Yeah. And when we first came into this project, we thought they were trying to comply with the general data protection regulation that's happening in the EU, because they're a global organization. But what we really learned was actually they're just trying to get their content cleaned up from this sort of sprawl that's been occurring in the organization. Can you talk a little bit about what their objectives were? What were they trying to do with content? Exactly. To your point, we sort of went into it thinking it was very GDPR driven. But we found out that it wasn't so much that driving the initiative, even though that is something sort of top of mind for them, that they are sort of working towards being compliant. This initiative was more driven around data protection. They're in a really competitive industry, and so for them, any sort of security breach could be very costly in many ways. So for them, it was all about securing their information, securing their data, and getting everything sort of in-house. They had noticed a lot was sort of starting to sprawl on a lot of disparate systems. And this was sort of from the board of directors level and asked to the organization to really sort of get a little bit more sophisticated, or maybe much more sophisticated around that compliance for their data protection. Gotcha. So sprawl, we've used that word a couple of times. You know what? We've heard a lot about consumerization of IT and shadow IT. And I mean, I think what we're talking about is like Dropbox and Box and these other disparate third-party tools that people are starting to store and share information with. Can you tell us about your perception of what their end users are trying to do? Like, what were their needs in the organization? Yeah, so this is a very entrepreneurial culture and really sort of enables their people to be biased towards action. And so they really want to be
enablers of their people getting their work done.
Right.
And so there's this balance with IT around sort of wanting to enable their folks to just get their work done without any obstacles. And then there's also this need to be, it being sort of a big global organization, there's a lot of sort of needs around the requirements of security. So the sprawl there and the end user needs, it's exactly storing files and sharing files. They work a lot with external vendors, different agencies, different partners. And so that quick and easy, adaptable way of sharing information sort of externally and also within their teams internally and globally, they just sort of like pick the easiest systems that they know and that's quickly accessible to them and maybe had sort of their perception of the greatest user experience. And so sort of just like this bias to action, let's just get our work done and sort of an enabling culture to do that.
Right. So if they have this culture of let's just let people get their work done, and this agenda to try and from what I understood, kind of protect their information, protect their data. Mm-hmm. What was our approach to balancing those two? Like, what did we ultimately suggest in terms of what they should use?
Good question. So we were brought in, and the turnaround to needing to be compliant in terms of using sort of systems that are sanctioned by this organization and sort of deemed secure and appropriate. We had about 30 days to get this done and to get the organization off these sort of shadow IT, sort of cloud-based sharing tools.
So 30 days, just to stop you, 30 days to make the whole organization comply with this initiative around we need to be standardized on the systems that we use, move off of these third-party systems.
So it was maybe like 30 days in a week. And it was not only to get the organization, but it was sort of to create a plan around what we wanted to do and sort of what the ask was, and then figure out, these tools were going to meet that demand and then create the training, deliver the training in the same way, create the messaging and the change and sort of deliver the messaging and the change. So there was a lot going on. But it was 30 days to plus a week. So
it's crazy. And what tools did you end up recommending? What is that landscape look like?
These guys are very heavily invested in the Microsoft suite. And so the scenarios that we had identified, which is probably a whole other question around how did we plan this, but there were sort of two main scenarios we were working with. One was more the personal file storage scenario, typical things for Dropbox, Google Drive, Box, what have you. And so for that, we sort of funneled all that into the use case of using your personal OneDrive.
Gotcha.
And then the other main one was the use case around sharing files with external partners, collaborating within teams, having a place that everybody can access information. And for that, we transition them to groups, Office 365 groups, which was very exciting. So that was very, very new for them. And they had been using some of the traditional SharePoint sites in the past, and the adoption there was a little bit tricky. It's, kind of clunky as we know to sort of set those up and for users to really just start adopt and run with those. It hadn't been really smooth. And so groups was a really nice way to present sort of the future of the collaboration tools from Microsoft.
Right. Yeah. So going back to then your point around, I think there's another question around what were their problems? How did we, they had started to collect some user stories, as I understand, around how people were using it. What did we do for the research part of this?
Yeah. So part of the big effort of this project was creating a plan that would be flexible enough to fit into whatever scope that this ended up being.
Right. Because you don't know what you don't know going in. We're being really agile in this project.
Exactly. So we really had we sort of had a sense, the IT partners we were working with had an idea of how many files were being sort of used, probably not on the systems, but we truly didn't know how much we would have to work with, how much we would have to transition in.
Right.
Yeah, the research was around, so we had a sense of, we sort of had gut feeling around sort of how much people were maybe using Dropbox and WeTransfer. And so what we did is given the tight timeline, we sort of had to use personal networks sort of within the IT group run. They had partners in different regions, sort of IT partners in different regions that they would use to reach out to their sort of key business units. We had an idea of which business groups maybe did the most work with external agencies, sort of which groups did the most work with sort of sharing globally, sort of head office to global branch sharing. Right. And so we had a sense. There was a lot of sort of phone calls around, hey, this change is coming. We think this might impact you, but we'd sort of like to give you a chance to talk through.
What are you doing?
Exactly. That kind of thing. So there was sort of a lot of that discovery going on as we were building out the training that was very based on scenarios. And so there was lots of sort of parallel streams of work going on in that first week.
Yeah. So you've got some insight around how people are using the tool. Some of it they had. We got the chosen technology that we're going to go to.
Yeah.
Tell me about the rollout. You've had 30 days. What do you do to help users transition to these new tools?
Yeah, so to my earlier point around like having to be flexible enough to manage this really exploding or this being pretty basic, what we wanted to hit on a bunch of different types of support. And so one of the first things we did is write sort of pretty basic training material, and we really made this centered around scenarios we were expecting. So how do I move from Dropbox to OneDrive? How do I move from WeTransfer to Groups? Right. So we really wanted to make it simple for them and not feel like they're reading an IT training manual. So we wrote that out and sort of split it out into, we called them user guides. So we had that available. And then what we did as well is we hosted live training sessions. Right. They use Zoom, which is really great for sort of global. It's so easy to join Zoom and so to sort of have a really good session there. So we had, I think, about 10 or 12 sessions, and we had scheduled them to hit on every geography. So we had at least two for Europe, like at least two for Asia. And so it actually wasn't that bad. They're just early mornings and late nights, but not too crazy. And those were with 2 Habanero consultants, and we sort of took them through the training. We also built in some time in there for questions. We had someone monitoring chat questions. What we also set up was this concept of office hours, just in case something were to come up in one of those training sessions, or a question or a use case, or, hey, my group actually sort of works this way, and I'm not too sure these tools are actually going to be able to fulfill that. And so the concept of office hours was to book one-on-one time with us to sort of walk through those scenarios, identify if there were exceptions we had to deal with, or just sort of walk them through the transitioning of their files into those systems. So we also had a sort of discussion forum going on as a way for folks to bypass tech support. They could post a question directly to the discussion forum. We had also used, which was really neat, our project group, sort of with this organization in Habanero, we were collaborating on an Office 365 group. And with that comes a shared inbox. And so we actually use that email address to send that out to the organization as support for them too.
Cool.
So they could ask questions directly to the project team, and we were on there all the time monitoring.
Yeah, it's great. Eating your own dog food on
exactly. And we learned a lot actually from working on that. It's neat because we're external partners. And so we were signed on as external partners, and we were sort of figuring out a lot of the users.
What it's going to be like for their external partners when they're using it. Yeah,
absolutely. So I think it made our documents a lot more richer that way because we had firsthand experience and sort of opinions about how it worked.
So we've got the technology we use, we have kind of the rollout and the strategy and how we learned about their problems. Mm-hmm. Let's see. This is putting you on the spot because I know your colleagues that were helping you would probably be better to answer this, but like you just mentioned, we discovered a bunch as we got to use the tool. Anything stood out for you? Because I mean, these are pretty used tools in organizations. People who use things like Dropbox love Dropbox. I feel like there's lots of potential risk around saying to people, no, you can't use that anymore. Anything that you discovered in this journey around Groups or the Microsoft Suite?
What was really interesting for me, because I mean, we use Microsoft Suite stuff here, and I sort of use Groups, but I think I use it at a pretty basic level here internally. And it was really nice to go through really different business use cases with the same tool.
Right.
And Groups is really exciting, you know, like it's very, very powerful. And one thing that was tricky when I was sort of planning and writing the training was that there's so many different ways to do things on these systems,
right?
Which can be, you sort of feel like you have to explain like, the 8 different ways to access X, Y, Z. But really it's a very natural process now to just have your own habits on there. And it really was very fluid with this organization on training. Of course, for us, it was a balance. Okay, these are like 1 or 2 key ways to do this, but you would find that they would already be finding their own ways into it. And it was really nice. But
right.
Yeah, Groups and the modern team site, it's really exciting. Yeah, cool. I was definitely surprised by how powerful it was.
Yeah, and I mean, on that note, we hear Microsoft in the market talking about Teams all the time. Mm-hmm. I'm sure they were probably trying to poke us saying, hey, you guys should be using Teams. Can you give a little sense of like why we didn't choose Teams? Like what was the rationale around that?
Yeah, for sure. And it's a good question too, because this organization they're early adopters. They get really excited. They're sort of on the list to get the first release, and they sort of love trying new things for sure. But it being a pretty big organization to their ecosystem of systems is pretty complex. At the same time that we were going through this project, they were relaunching their intranet, a full redesign of their Jive platform. And Jive also has a lot of collaboration tools and communication capabilities that they were also wanting to make available to the organization. And they do use Slack, but IT's sort of not sure if that's something they actually feel good about, but the users are all about it. So there was already a lot going on, and Groups was going to be very new to them. And so we decided to wait on Teams maybe a few months down the road. But I think there's a little bit of positioning to figure out around like what tool when.
Right.
There's a lot of options.
Maybe displace Slack eventually, but
I think that's IT's plan. But whether the organization is going to be game for that is something to figure out for sure.
Makes sense.
But
Cool.
we did have a few questions about Teams from users come in through chat and through training. So some folks know about it.
Why aren't you?
Yeah, like what's going on? Why not Teams? And what is Teams? So
it's a word that it's a word that you use a lot in this. So it's I can see the source of the confusion.
Totally.
In the organization.
Yeah.
Last question. Now, if you think about the other customers we might have that are challenged with the same problem, maybe they need to be compliant with the GDPR. Maybe they have a bunch of Dropboxes all over their organization and they're concerned around their intellectual property or their content and where it sits. Any words of advice on kind of how to do this well or?
Yeah. The team here, it's funny, even with such a tight project, we spent a lot of time upfront planning, which felt a bit risky when we were doing it, but we sort of had a good gut feeling that it was the right way to approach it.
Yeah.
And so we spent a lot of time trying to understand how they currently use the tools that we were going to be essentially removing and what drew them to that and sort of what were the features within that they wanted and were using. And we did a good comparison to what we were making available to them. And so we really made the communication and the messaging based on that. And also the training focused on the sort of one-for-one for usability. And so we really spent a lot of time sort of in that scenario-based training materials that I talked about, but really sort of front-loading the work, even though it felt kind of scary. And the execution of the work was pretty short. Everything went smoothly and the deadline's been met and everything's good, but it can feel like it's not worth it. But I think that's what makes all the difference is sort of planning the experience of the change in terms of like change management, I guess, but also of the user's experience of the new tool.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's easy to just assume that these tools, like maybe Dropbox, they just installed it on their desktop and they started using it. That they're just going to do that with something else. But going that extra mile and getting in there and understanding how they're using it and making sure especially when you're ripping something out and replacing it.
Yeah, it was interesting because this was a mandated change. It wasn't hey, we'd like to get off these systems. How do you feel about these instead? Use this instead. It's like, well, you're going to have to use these instead. And so for us, it was an exercise in how do we make that as smooth and positive and leaving them with a feeling of that they've gained something instead of that they've been stripped of something that they actually like. And so that was actually some direction we got from the organization really early on around like we really are very sensitive to them not feeling like IT's taking something away.
Right. And on that note, though, what was their strategy? You've told me this, but let me say it. What was their strategy for not letting people use these other tools? Like, what did they decide in that?
Right. So that's a great question because they definitely went back and forth on this because it was something that the organization had to report back to the board on. There needed to be a very strict plan in place. And throughout the month, there was a lot of back and forth around, okay, we're going to block these systems or we're just going to not block them, but monitor and sort of use policy. And so we ended up not going the blocking route and it just being something we've set up a lot of monitoring now and there'll be follow-up around sort of people who are not compliant and trying to understand why and all of that.
So you can work with people in the organization, make sure those edge cases that maybe you didn't get to still get people can still do their work and stuff.
Exactly. So there was always the risk of there being some business critical functions that we just hadn't reached.
Totally.
And it just didn't feel like the right thing to do to turn those off.
Cool.
So.
Alrighty. So thanks, Mel. We're back. We pre-recorded the interview. It was just a little bit less nerve-wracking to have it pre-recorded, but we're jumping back into a question and answer period. And I guess a couple things when I am looking now as to whether or not there are any questions, and I'm noticing all the people who are trying to raise their hand and tell us that there were audio problems in the beginning. So we apologize again for that. But we just want to open up the same question forum if you have a question to ask about anything that you just heard in the interview or anything in the presentation so far. So feel free to ask us any questions and we'll sit here for just a moment to see if anything comes in. Mel, I don't know, I'm going to totally put you on the spot for this. Anything out of today's presentation that you want to add or any insight to?
I guess just re-listening to that, I would definitely recommend to plan for more than 30 days to do something like this. Just sort of listening. I guess this project was a few months ago now, and I've had some time and distance to look back on it. And everything went well, but I definitely think that an initiative like this would benefit from more than a month.
Right. So that's not a super realistic time
Yeah,
period.
exactly. I think it was really driven by an ask from the board, and it was sort of completely non-negotiable. We just must get this done. And as much as it was a pretty positive experience and the change was successful, I think it sort of comes at a cost, right? Like things have to give for that aggressive a deadline. So just off the top of my head, I would think that it'd be definitely nice to plan for more than a month. And this is something ongoing that you'll sort of need support and engagement, providing support and engagement to the organization for a while.
And one thing that struck me too is, on the same note, is the idea of how much time we spend on planning around this stuff. Like, is there a percentage that you'd say is kind of the project that you'd say is a good percent to be putting on planning? I think of like Google's Sprint Week, where you have 5 days, and basically 2 of those days, the sort of first day of research and the second day of kind of designing.
Yeah, and then 2-day build and 1-day test.
Yeah, kind of planning day. So that's like 40%. You have a percent that's like, well, you know what? How long should you be in there with your end users? And
I mean, that feels about right. I think an interesting way to do it too is to sort of have the flexibility to plan and try a little bit and then iterate on that plan and adjust. So it's sort of maybe a mix of planning and doing. This didn't actually end up working out because we couldn't get it going quick enough, but we had wanted to do a test, I guess, with a certain group, where we wanted to try out our training and try out our scenarios with this certain group that we knew would be quite, forgiving or lenient, or sort of be game to provide a lot of feedback. Christmas got in the way, and we couldn't do that, and we sort of had to launch to the global organization right away in January, but that was totally something we would have loved to have done, is sort of test your plan really early. So it's a mix of planning and sort of doing. So 40 feels good. The tricky thing with this project is that we didn't have a good sense of scope. We were moving from sort of rogue third-party tools that we didn't have visibility into. So our plan had to span a bunch of different types of scenarios. And so I think the planning was a bit heavier in that regard too. So I think it totally depends, but there's a lot of value in planning and also testing that plan early on.
Great. Well, there's no other questions that have come in, so I will say to everyone, what's maybe next for you. If you sign up for our newsletter, we'll let you know when this webinar, sans the first 19 minutes, is available online. So starting from when the audio starts. And we also have a couple upcoming posts from Habanero that you should watch out for. One of my colleagues is creating a post around collaborating beyond organizational boundaries. So really digging into that use case around replacing Dropbox or those kinds of things. As well as we have a post coming out with our position on Microsoft Hubs. We've been doing some work behind the scenes with experimenting with hubs and kind of have a position on where that plays into the organization. And Mel and I would love to hear from you. You feel free, super open door to write us. Let us know what you thought about today, whether or not there's something else that you would love to get from us, or if you have an opportunity that you'd love to just discuss and kind of pick our brain at. Feel free to contact either of us and let us know what you're thinking. And we will end the webinar there and say thanks everyone for joining today.